Welcome everyone to this IPPR event on zero carbon homes and the UK's Retrofit Challenge. I know some people are still joining, but we are going to kick off the event. My name is Luke Murphy and I'm the Associate Director for Energy, Climate, Housing and Infrastructure at IPPR. What a week to be having this event on decarbonising Britain's housing stock. You wait for one net zero strategy to come along and then about 1 million come overnight in one day. So if any of the panelists or indeed our audience has managed to make it through the near 3,000 pages that have been published by the government since Monday, then please do make themselves known, because they should very much definitely get a special prize. But it is a great week to be having this discussion, because at last we are in receipt of the government's long-awaited heat and building strategy, as well as the net zero strategy and a number of other strategies, as I mentioned. So the government has very much set out its stall, but IPPR has done so as well. And we're really pleased to be talking about our piece of research today on how we decarbonise the UK's housing stock in our report, Pump Up the Volume, a comprehensive plan to decarbonise the UK's homes. And we're really grateful to Santander for their support of this research. I think many people attending this event today will be aware of the challenge that we face. Our homes make a significant contribution to our carbon emissions, and it has long been seen as a hard to decarbonise sector. And we also know that the transition to net zero is entering a new phase, one where it no longer occurs in the background, kind of separate from people's lives. The way in which we decarbonise our economy now is going to touch on the way people heat their homes, the way they travel and get around, and the jobs that they do. And decarbonising our housing stock is one of those major challenges that is going to involve disruption. It's going to involve policy makers, decision makers, and leaders across the country to really engage the public around the decisions that need to be made and the solutions that are on offer. I'm not going to talk too much about the research, because we've got a fantastic presentation coming up from my colleague Joshua Emden, who is a research fellow at IPPR, and that will be followed by a fantastic panel discussion from our panel, who I'm going to introduce right now. But we will have short contributions from our speakers, and then we will go into a Q&A discussion. Please feel free to use the chat if you would like to make contributions, but if you would like to ask a question, I would really ask you to use the question and answer function, and if you don't necessarily have a question you'd like to ask yourself, please do consider upvoting someone else's question if you see that someone else has already asked something that you know you would like to hear from our speakers. So our panel today, we have Philip Dunn MP, who is the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, and I'm sure is going to have lots to say about both the government strategy and also the IPPR work that we put forward earlier this week, and the work that we've been doing over the past 18 months. And I'm sure Philip's committee now has much to scrutinise in terms of the government's agenda. We have Zoe Gujalaro, who is the policy manager, the Future Energy Service or Future Energy Services at Citizens Advice. We have Anika Kelly, who is the engagement lead for the Retrofit team at the Carbon Co-op. We have Jenny Holland, who is the Public Affairs and Policy Specialist at the UK Green Building Council. And we have Tracy Pearce, who is the Chief Customer Officer of Homes at Santander. And we also have, as I mentioned, Joshua Emden, who is the Research Fellow at IPPR. First of all, I'm going to hand over to Tracy, who's going to give some brief introductory remarks. Then we'll go to Josh for his, who's going to talk through our findings and recommendations of our report. Then to panelists for their 5-minute responses, and I will be keeping them to time on that. And then we'll go to the Q&A with the audience and questions before closing at midday. But first of all, Tracy, over to you for some opening remarks. Tracy.
Thank you, Luke, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for putting together such a comprehensive report on this issue. I think considering the focus on energy prices in the news at the moment and yesterday's announcement of the government's heat and building strategy, this report is really timely, and it presents a strong case for why we need to really focus on greening the UK's housing stock. Housing makes up for around 13% of the UK emissions, so the need to make homes greener is only going to become more and more important. There are a few areas I'd like to pick up on, and then I'll hand across to the IPPR team to talk through the report. Firstly, I think it's worth highlighting why a bank like Santander is interested in retrofitting. As we approach COP26, we're seeing more and more businesses commit to net zero targets, encouraged by governments around the globe that realise we need to make changes to society and the economy to limit the impacts of global warming. Earlier this year, Santander committed to be net zero by 2050. And for a bank, being net zero means that our lending book needs to be carbon neutral. From a mortgage perspective, this means improving the energy efficiency of both the residential and rental homes that we lend to. But it's important that the role of lenders broadens to support homeowners and landlords on this journey. We need to help customers with less energy efficient homes to understand the net zero challenge. And it's a real opportunity for us to try to become more innovative in how we provide that support to our customers. I believe that by engaging homeowners early, lenders can play a key role in improving the standard of our homes and making sure that customers aren't left behind. For me, one area that this report really highlights is that we need to be helping to educate homeowners on what they can do to make their homes carbon neutral. Most people don't understand why they need to make their homes greener, how to go about it, or the long-term benefits of lower household costs. So the report's recommendation for a national awareness campaign are crucial and really welcome. And this is an area where businesses like Santander can play a role too. We have a huge pool of customers that are homeowners, and we can help them to understand what they need to do. Now, we've already started to do this through our Energy Fact report. It's a tailored report for new mortgage customers outlining specific changes that they can make to improve the energy efficiency of their home. And we'll be rolling out more communications to customers over the next few months to help them understand what they can do as well. And alongside this education piece, we need to ensure that support with the cost of retrofitting is made available. The report estimates that the average cost of a retrofit is around £10,000, which the majority of people don't have available to them. And this is a particular problem for those that are financially less well off. The properties that are often most in need of work can be owned or lived in by those least able to afford the cost of retrofitting or higher rental charges. And frankly, if the choice for a family is between installing a heat pump or paying their existing energy bills, then it's understandable why there is little enthusiasm for retrofitting at the moment. The financial support here needs to be in the billions, not the hundreds of millions, if we are to see retrofitting at the scale we need for the UK to hit its net zero targets. So it's great to see IPPR making the case for widely available grant funding to support homeowners with the retrofitting and full grants for fuel poor homes. One of the main reasons that retrofitting isn't popular at the moment is the cost. So adopting these recommendations will go a long way towards tackling the problem. Overall, I think this report makes some really important recommendations on how we can work together to make the UK's homes greener. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the panel, and thank you for your time this morning.
Thanks so much, Tracy, for your contribution, and to Santander for supporting the research. And I know that Tracy has to drop off at 11 as well, so thanks very much. Now I'm going to pass over to Josh, who is going to give a presentation on the findings and recommendations of our work. Josh.
Yeah, thanks very much, Luke, and thanks very much, Tracy, as well. I think you've really helped me out there because you've flagged up a couple of the policies in advance, and that's meant that hopefully I'll be able to go through this a little bit quicker. But yes, so I suppose I'll start off just by running through what I'm going to talk about today. So I'll go through some key messages, set out what the actual target is, what it is we're actually talking about, how much of this we need, and then the benefits, the challenges, some international case studies that we've done as part of this research. And then I'll attempt to talk through some core recommendations that kind of compare what we've said to the heat and building strategy with the knowledge that it only came out yesterday. So do bear with. But I suppose the first thing to say and the first thing to highlight are these some key messages which basically suggest that, firstly, even if climate change didn't exist, the benefits of retrofitting would be worthwhile anyway, and we'll go through them in a little bit. Obviously, climate change sets out the urgent timeline by which we need to do these things, but it's still very much worthwhile in its own right. Secondly, that the government has made a cautiously good start with the heat and building strategy, but there's a lot more to do. And as we'll see in a second, particularly on clear communication and a number of other things as well, but there's this one in particular. And then finally, there's popular support for an ambitious retrofit program. We did some polling which demonstrates that, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But it's more also worth saying that it's more ambitious than what the government has put out at the moment. But the focus today, I suppose it's worth saying as well, when we're talking about the target and when we talk about retrofit, we're going to be focusing on energy efficiency and heat pumps because it's estimated that around 21 million homes, which is the vast majority of homes, will need to be retrofitted with these technologies. We are, of course, cognizant that there are lots of other technologies around, but this is what we're focusing on. But it's worth just spelling out the extent of what's needed. So what we have here is a graph that demonstrates the amount of heat pumps and different types of insulation that we need to be installing by 2028. And this is an annual target. It's not a cumulative target. So we need to be building up to this annual rate. To give you an idea of what that means, between 2021, so now, and 2022, we need to be quadrupling the number of heat pumps that we are installing. We need to be doubling the loft and solid wall insulation that we're installing. And we need to be increasing cavity wall insulation by 77%. That's just in 1 year. To get us up to these targets of by 2028 and 2030. So there's a huge amount that needs to be done in terms of the scale of the challenge. To very quickly recap over the benefits, this is something that I think lots of us are aware of, but it's always worth looking at what the prize is, if you like. There's huge job creation potential. So a Greenpeace study recently looked at net job creation by 2030 and estimated that up to 138,000 jobs will be created in the economy. There's a potential for lower energy bills by combining insulation and heat pumps, because heat pumps use a lot less energy than gas boilers. And that's really worth saying. And especially with insulation, the heat doesn't get out as much, so it lowers your energy bills. There's also things that we can be doing to lower the price of electricity itself, but we might get into that in a little bit. There's the potential for healthier homes. That's both in terms of the comfort of the home, but also reducing the instances of cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. And that can save the NHS billions of pounds, as well as making people's lives more comfortable. And then finally, in particular, in light of gas price rises and a real crisis in terms of cost of living, it will lower our dependency on gas. Because electricity will increasingly be decarbonised, and that's what heat pumps use. But there are several challenges, and these benefits won't be realised unless we address these key challenges. I'll go through these relatively quickly, because again, I think they are relatively familiar, and Tracy's already highlighted a fair few of them. So financial barriers, obviously talking about upfront costs being a major barrier to most homes that we're talking about. And as we'll see, that still applies even when we consider the government's new grants. There's also a question of running costs, but as I say, as we've mentioned, lower energy bills are something that we can aspire to, but there's some things that need to happen to make that happen. Industry barriers, by which I mean both the provision of the right kind of training and also the scale of the provision of training. So we need a lot more people to be trained and trained well in order to ramp up demand for different kinds of low carbon heating technologies, and also to give the public confidence in these new technologies. And then finally, implementation barriers, by which I mean things like problems with local capacity to actually deliver these schemes, consumer trust in the actual proposition itself, and also getting over the fact that it is going to be a disruptive process as well, and the fact that there'll be different kinds of tenure types, different kinds of houses that will have different kinds of needs, and all of that is going to need to be overcome, and a lot of it will come through clear communication and good installation practices, but it's still something that we really need to bear in mind. This is particularly the case when we're talking about awareness, and it's really worth highlighting. We did some polling with YouGov, which demonstrated that people are very unfamiliar with a lot of these technologies, particularly in the case of heat pumps. So 58% of people have either never heard of or know nothing about heat pumps, even if they have heard of them. What it demonstrates is that there's a real information gap when it comes to these technologies, even if, as we'll see in a little bit, there is support for promoting them. But that's something that we wanted to highlight as a particular challenge. Looking at lessons from international case studies is really interesting, because when you look at Germany, France and Italy, they are all a bit further ahead than us on some policy design. So Germany for some time has been offering substantial loans with repayment subsidies, which is where the government pays back a subsidy depending on the increase in energy efficiency that's achieved, and they help to pay back the loan. France offers grants for retrofits that are higher for low-income families, and Italy offers what's known as a super bonus that pays back 110% cost of upgrades to either the homeowner or the third party, whoever actually pays for the kit. All of these are policies, particularly in Germany, that have been going for a little bit. Italy was more recently introduced. France was building on existing policy, but all of them are more ambitious than what currently sits in the heat and building strategy. So what are we proposing to do about this? And also, I suppose it's worth keeping in mind, what are the 5 policy areas where we think the government could also be looking into this more? So in order to be, I suppose, slightly not to be too sloganistic about these things, we've come up with 5 areas that we need to focus on, which are standards, and when I say standards, I mean regulation, and setting clear targets, skills in terms of ramping up industry capacity, cash in terms of the funding that's available, communications, which is that clear raising of awareness that I mentioned earlier, and then capacity, which is very much about kind of ramping up local authority capacity. So in terms of standards, we recommend by 2028 that all EPCs, so that's the energy performance certificate, the energy efficiency rating for a property on private rented properties, should be C. We should be banning the sale of oil boilers. We should be introducing a whole house heat standard which puts energy efficiency and low carbon heating together and is installing them together. This is something that's really, really important to avoid any kind of risk of incompatible installation, I should say, between energy efficiency and low carbon heating. We're also suggesting introducing point of sale regulations and point of renovation regulations to meet an EPC of C by 2030. And as the Climate Change Committee has recommended, a ban on the sale of gas boilers by 2033. If we look at what's in the heat and building strategy, regulation is actually something where we are quite positive about what's existing so far. So there is a consultation to ban the sale of oil boilers by 2026, which is even earlier than we're suggesting. EPC regulation for the private sector by 2028, which is great. And there's consideration of homeowners in future, if not a commitment, and a confirmed ambition to phase out gas boilers by 2035. We'd like it to be a confirmed ban, and we'd like it to be by 2033, but understanding the current politics around and the optics of doing so, this is something that is good for now and potentially could be improved on in future. Looking at skills, we are recommending expanding the training of standards to encourage the installation of energy efficiency and low carbon heating together. This is something that, again, to match the regulation that we've talked about with the whole house heat standard, this is something that's going to be really important, and it's worth stressing that at the moment, energy efficiency retrofitting and low carbon heating are separate industries. And in order to maximize the customer experience, we really need to be encouraging putting these supply chains together. So we're recommending having training standards that encourage that concurrent training. The second thing is having a £160 million per year training support. So that's supporting with the course costs to incentivize installers to actually take up this training. There is some evidence that the government has done which suggests that the government is, that the installers are keen to take up training, but there needs to be support to actually incentivize them to do so. And then finally, we need to be co-developing good quality job standards with unions and with the installers themselves. And what I mean by that is that at the moment, the industry is awash with quite a lot of insecure work, and it's quite difficult to set out a clear career path in this industry. So we need to make this industry attractive to attract new workers and scale up the number of skills to meet demand. In terms of what's in the heat and building strategy, there is I suppose, a theory that setting out clear policy plan in itself acts as a demand driver to invest in the workforce. So that is a good step. And there's lots of research about the availability of skilled installers and a commitment to work with industry. But there's consideration of government by government of potential to put incentives in place, but there's no actual concrete policy yet. Finally, penultimately, on funding. We've set out a phased approach to our funding plan. This very much matches what's in the Climate Change Committee, but what it suggests is a clear ramping up between 2021 to 2025 and 2026 to 2030. This gives you the overall outline of the total amount of funding that's needed, which is quite substantial. So up to 18 billion in the first 5 years, 47 billion in the next 5 years, and then just over 35 billion in the final phase. What this looks like in practice is grants of £7,500 between now and 2025, zero interest loans, full grants for fuel poor homes, as Tracy mentioned, and then a wash of other considerations that need to be put in place regardless of what kind of grant scheme or loan scheme you're doing. So moving policy costs over to general taxation is a key ask, and we can, I'm sure, get into that a little bit more in time. Stamp duty and VAT incentives to be included as well. And then also consideration of private finance initiatives, including green mortgages, demand aggregated financing, and community municipal bonds. That's going to be something that could be really important in future, particularly because the government is considering market-based mechanisms. But we can get into that in a little bit. And what we should reiterate is that at least in the first 5 years, we think public funding is going to be really important, substantial public funding, and indeed more so than what exists already, is going to be needed to kickstart the market. In terms of what the government's put out, well, at the moment, there's some good amount of funding for energy efficiency and heat pumps for off-gas grid fuel poor homes with the Home Upgrade Grant. But it's worth saying that what else exists in terms of the £5,000 grant for low carbon heating only has £450 million allocated to it. It's only over 3 years, so it will only help on average 30,000 homes per year, and it's not enough, and it doesn't necessarily take account of low-income homes. There's consideration of market-based mechanisms in the future, as I mentioned, but at the moment that's not quite been substantiated. It's worth pointing out that we've looked at different grant scenarios, and we've estimated how much additional cost, once you take away the grant, once you factor in the grant, how much additional cost would be put on households, and we've looked at this by income level. And it's worth saying that as this clearly demonstrates, at the lower end of lower income households have substantially higher costs, or the cost would be a substantially higher proportion of their annual household income. So it's worth saying that even with generous grants, or even with a £5,000 grant, this would still put a lot of burden on these households, and it would be unaffordable for them. The final thing to mention, and I'll cut off capacity because I think that is important, but it's something that we can talk about in the chat, I think. But what's really key that we kind of really want to stress is we need to roll out a national information campaign at the UK level, complemented by a well-advertised, properly resourced National Energy Advice Service, and I'll get onto that, what that means in a second. And we also need to be introducing household-level building renovation plans that have personalised information. All of this needs to be rolled up within a consistent brand as well. So we've in the past suggested a Green Go scheme, which would have information not just about energy advice services, but also about all the different range of grants that we're proposing. And it would be able to direct people to find the right grants for them. In the government strategy, there is a commitment to a simple energy advice service, but I've tried it and it's okay. There's a website and a phone service, but it needs to be much more comprehensive. It needs to be much better resourced, and it needs to be similar to how it operates in Scotland and in Wales, where you can call up and you can get bespoke advice that sends you or directs you to the right kind of financing scheme or funding scheme to help you get the support that you need. And that's something that we need in England. We also need a lot more resource for all of these advice services. And there's also, it remains to be seen, but there's no overall plan for a national information campaign. This is something that we've polled, and I'll skip these a second. This is something we've polled along with a range of other recommendations, but particularly the National Information Campaign. 65% of people either somewhat supported or strongly supported information. So if you compare the slide earlier that we had about a lack of awareness around technologies and couple this with a clear need for a National Information Campaign, it clearly demonstrates that people want to know more about this. It's also interesting, as I mentioned before, that there is quite a lot of support for different kinds of schemes like grants and loans, as this polling shows. So in total, we have a picture to reiterate this point that there is public support for a more ambitious scheme, particularly in terms of information and more generous grants. Obviously, there's some policies we've tested on banning gas boilers and carbon taxation as well, where people are a bit more unsure, but in general, there's still more support than there is opposition to that. So I suppose that's, again, just reiterating that there is some kind of public support for a more ambitious programme than what the government has at the moment. Finally, I'll end on this final slide with some somewhat arbitrary grades, but just to kind of go through how we see this comparing to how we see the heat and building strategy comparing to what we've put out in our report. So we think standards, as I mentioned, are in quite a good place, but and in capacity, we also think that the government's been talking quite a good game about giving support to local energy hubs. Again, I've skipped that off in the interest of time, but happy to go into that in more detail. But in all other areas, in terms of skills, cash, and communication, there's a lot more work that needs to be done if we're going to be meeting the scale of the challenge and also meeting the scale of what the public expect, or what the public support as well. I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Josh, for a very comprehensive view of what is a very comprehensive report. I'm looking forward to the discussion. We've got lots of questions already coming in. So we're going to come to Philip Dunn next, who I know has to rush off in 10 minutes to ask a question in COP questions very person. So I'm going to hand over to Philip, and then we'll go to our speakers, and then we'll get into discussion. Philip.
Thank you very much, Luke, and thank you, Joshua, for your terrific report. I think the IPPR has done some really useful work and across the whole energy efficiency of buildings sector. And this is, of course, utterly key if the UK is going to achieve our now legal commitment to reach net zero Britain by 2050. The government has had a series of, that's politely described as stop-start initiatives, or start-stop, perhaps a better way of putting it, in this area. And it is incredibly timely, as you said in your introduction, Luke, that we're having this discussion the day after the publication of the documents for the heat and building strategy, the net zero strategy, and the net zero review, which I have to confess I have not read in full yet because it's very substantial. The Environmental Audit Committee undertook a piece of work into energy efficiency in buildings. We published a report. As it happened, with rather less good timing than this event, we published our report the week before the government scrapped the Green Homes Grant Scheme. For lots of good reasons, because its implementation was very poor. But our committee had welcomed that scheme as the first attempt for some time to allow homeowners to participate in some support for energy efficiency, and in particular because the manifesto on which I and the government were elected ahead of the 2019 election had a commitment for £9.2 billion of energy efficiency in buildings measures, but they were very much focused on social housing and public buildings, and not very focused in terms of allocating any money towards owner-occupiers or the private rented sector, which the Green Homes Grant Scheme did. So the announcement this week of the heat and building strategy is a welcome evolution of that manifesto commitment, and they've allocated £3.9 billion over 3 years, as we were hearing from Josh. We know 450 million of that is going towards heat pumps specifically, and I think that will form probably much of the conversation today. the issues that we were most concerned about from the Green Homes Grant Scheme was the limited duration of the scheme, which had a major challenge both for contractors to be able to gear up to deliver it, and for the confidence of consumers that this scheme was going to be available for them. So we called for an overhaul of the scheme and for this to be extended in duration, and that any successor scheme needed to be developed in close cooperation with the contracting industry, so that we learnt the lessons from the mistakes of that scheme and could start to rebuild confidence within the employing community, the contractors who are going to have to do this work, because of the lack of skills, which was touched on in Josh's report, and the need to retrain and reskill many existing contractors. We learnt that in our report that there were over 100,000 companies are currently certified to install gas boilers in people's homes, and they do 1.7 million a year. In January, there were only 1,300 companies certified to undertake heat pump installations, which is a very different skill. You have to do the calculations, which involves quite a lot of maths as to what is going to be the requirement, the load in order to heat properties, because they're all different. You can't standardize this. You have to actually assess every house individually, and that is a very different skill, and it's not the same as a plumbing skill. It requires different things. It's electrical apart from anything else. So there's an enormous opportunity for companies to get involved in delivering electrification, decarbonisation of our homes, but unless there's clarity about the demand signals that the government is going to give, which we've got now in part, it wasn't going to get going. We only install, I think this last 2019, I heard on the radio this morning, 35,000 heat pumps in the UK. When we were doing our inquiry, it was about 30,000 a year at a time when France is installing 150,000. So we are some way behind the curve internationally on this. And one of the other critical conclusions that we came to was that swapping a gas boiler for a heat pump doesn't do it. The heat pump only works effectively if it's being installed in a properly insulated building. And the costs, I note from your report, you've estimated something like £12,000 on average per property to insulate. The work that we did with the evidence we had from the Northern Building Consortium and other major landlords of social housing around the country was that it was closer to £20,000 in addition to the heat pump in order to insulate their estate properly. So this measure for heat pump support is very welcome. I can understand why the government have only extended it for the duration of the spending review, because they believe, and I heard Kwasi Kwarteng saying this on the radio this morning, that the private sector manufacturers will bring down the cost of heat pumps once demand grows, and I think he's right in that. But I also think it's really important for the government to recognise that it's not just about heat pumps. They're doing so in the Home Upgrade Grant Scheme for fuel poor, and they're doing it in the social housing arena with the decarbonisation of social housing fund, which is great. But I think the presumption that owner-occupiers are going to be able to afford to do this is not necessarily correct. I'd just like to make one point for Santander, our host today, and that's in relation to mortgage books. If the mortgage providers decide that they need to move their books to EPC-C rated properties at pace, it will mean that they will provide little mortgage finance to non-EPC rated properties. There are at present in England 10.6 million non-EPC rated properties owned by a household, owner-occupied, and close to 3 million private rented sector. Now we know that the private rented sector is moving in the direction of having to get to EPC, but there will always be properties that cannot make it, that will be exempt. And my plea to Santander is to think very carefully about how you're going to manage your book so that you don't effectively put a blight on properties that cannot achieve EPC-C because for whatever reason, because that would create a two-tier mortgage society, which I don't think we want.
Thanks so much, Philip, for that response. And I know you have to leave in a couple of minutes for questions. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us and contributing. And I'm sure everyone is very much looking forward to the EAC Committee's view and scrutiny of the many documents that came out yesterday. So thank you again for your comments and contribution. Look forward to that in future. Next up, we have Zoe. Over to you, Zoe.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Luke. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my comments on your report as part of the launch, and set against this backdrop of our current energy crisis and the need to avert a climate crisis. This report couldn't be more timely. And I'm sure lots of people have been reading with interest alongside all the other documents that have hit our inboxes this week. So for people that don't know, Citizens Advisor is a statutory watchdog for consumers in the energy market, and we consider energy to be an essential for life service. Our remit is to represent consumers today and in the future, which is why we are supportive of the transition to net zero, but also why we're very clear that it has to be an equitable and fair transition for all. So already we've heard some really interesting thoughts, and I've seen some really great comments in the chat. I'm going to keep my bit brief. There's lots I could say, some great stuff in response to Philip's, but I just wanted to share with you a couple of thoughts of what we think the most important challenges to scaling up low carbon retrofit in the UK, and how some of the key policies in this report, and not in this report, could help us to meet that challenge of net zero. So for me, one of the biggest challenges, and I think it's already been alluded to in the chat, is around delivering net zero across the board, but also in a fair way, is this issue of inclusion. So, you know, if we have to retrofit up to 29 million homes, we need it to be inclusive. We need, firstly, because of the sheer number of retrofits that we need to do, which means enabling people from all walks of life, all circumstances, regardless of location and finances. We need the numbers. We need the sheer numbers in order to achieve net zero. But secondly, the measures and technologies that we employ must be inclusive. People must be able to properly engage and use the technologies, such as low carbon heating systems, smart systems, if those carbon savings are to be realised. It's no good saying a heat pump will save X amount of carbon. It won't. If it's not working properly, it won't. If it's not being used properly. So we need things to be able to be used as intended, because they're not going to save the carbon that we think they are on paper. And I think that's incredibly important. And something that I talk about a lot is around engaging with the non-usual suspects. So those of us who attend these webinars, those of us who are party to lots of these conversations, we do tend to be the same people. And I would love it if we started to hear from other organisations that represent different groups of people, so we can have more voices in the room to ensure that any national campaign, for example, on communications will resonate with different people across the UK. So that is a good start for being inclusive, to have a national communication strategy, and it's something that we've been advocating for a while, to ensure that people understand what net zero is and what it might mean to them. And I'm really pleased to see that being amplified in this report. I'm also exceptionally pleased to see reference to a properly resourced energy advice service as an independent advice and information is going to be critical to building consumer confidence. And I'm one of the people that can remember what we used to fondly call the EACs, the Energy Efficiency Advice Centres. You know, lots of people focus on digital and say digital first. My response to that is, but that doesn't mean digital only. So we do really need to think about how we might be able to provide face-to-face services for people that need extra support, and that's going to be key. And that's not to say set up a whole new system. There are plenty of organisations out there providing face-to-face services that maybe you could tack some of this onto. And that leads me to talk about a couple of key policies that we think could help more with regards inclusion, but also with regards scaling up. And local area energy planning is one of those responses to decarbonising heat. The responses to decarbonising heat will need to be local in nature, and a local approach to energy planning could help with that, as it would be a more whole systems approach, and it could also help with those more tailored communications that we've already heard Philip and others talk about, and ensure that they're supported with face-to-face local services where they might be needed. However, we do believe that any local area energy planning needs to be dependent on a clear national framework to drive that, to ensure that there's parity across regions and to help build that resource and capacity at the local level. And it's great to see that a local net zero forum has been announced as part of the net zero strategy. And finally, we absolutely need to see much more robust consumer protections for the installation of energy efficiency and low carbon energy systems. It cannot be right that only government funded installations are subject to mandatory consumer protection schemes. Huge numbers of low carbon heating systems need to be installed in the next 7 years alone. And many of those will be funded outside of the recently announced boiler upgrade scheme. So people need to be protected when installing these new systems, regardless of how they pay for them. And for us at Citizens Advice, that is a big gap in the heat and building strategy that we really hope can be plugged. I think I'll leave it there, and I really look forward to some really great Q&A going forward.
Thanks so much, Zoe, and you've picked up, I think, some of the issues that have been raised in the chat and in the Q&A there on consumer protection and how we ensure kind of we build public trust and that the solutions are right for suitable for different households. So yeah, look forward to getting into this discussion on those. Up next, we've got Anika, over to you.
Hi, thanks very much. It's great to be invited. So I'm just going to share with you some of our on-the-ground experience of working with householders to retrofit. So my name's Anika, I'm from Carbon Co-op. So if anyone hasn't heard of us, we're a community organisation based in Greater Manchester. We've been around for about 10 years, and over those years, we basically formed around people wanting to take practical action on climate change. And a lot of that we realised about, 8-9 years ago was going to have to be around reducing gas use at home through retrofit. So over the years, we've been working with very environmentally motivated, kind of those super early adopters and pioneers, people who want to retrofit their homes. And through that, we've developed, alongside our membership, who are householders, services that work for them. And we initially started with providing more training and understanding of what retrofit means, how to deal with the complexity of it, and also supported them through creating a whole house assessment that they could use. We found through this that people were really keen and engaged. However, they often stalled lots of their projects. And that was because there was a lot of decision making that they had to do that was quite difficult, particularly when understanding some of the risks and complexities around it. It's really difficult to find contractors that they could trust to do the work. And there's also within that an expectation that people would have to become experts. Obviously, some of our membership did manage to complete really deep retrofits that were very successful using their own finance. However, not that many. We realised to be able to mainstream retrofit, more support was needed throughout the whole process to support, because we can't expect people to become experts. So out of this, we developed something called People-Powered Retrofit, which is an end-to-end householder service. So that kind of takes people right from the initial advice stage. So people can call up and have a 30-minute conversation with our retrofit advisor around what their situation is, what their home is, what their plans are, and see if it's appropriate to continue working with us. From that point, we then do a whole home retrofit, which is sort of, I think it was talked about in the report, kind of very personalised around their own ideas about what they want to do, if they've got extension plans, if they've got home improvement plans, alongside kind of bringing in our technical expertise around what could actually happen. It uses full SAP with some adjustments to it. And then we support them to create a brief. Following that, get some design details if design details are needed. The whole process follows sort of PAS 2035 for people familiar with that, which is the kind of government regulations for public funded works around retrofit. And then we also support that we've been developing the supply chain around Manchester to respond to householder demand. So when I talk about the supply chain, I'm kind of talking about, as well as retrofit assessors and retrofit coordinators and architects and other retrofit designers, it's also people's local builders, plasterers, plumbers, everyone that you would normally need in a building job. It's very much the RMI sector, repairs, maintenance, improvements. And then we'll support them on site, provide training for the contractors if they need training, and then post-works evaluation. So that was the plan, and we've been doing it for the last couple of years, and we haven't advertised our services. I mean, we have been around for about 10 years in Manchester, but it's kind of amazing that given we haven't advertised our services, we've been overwhelmed with inquiries. We've had sort of near 200 inquiries. We're working with 50 people. We've had to put a stop on our services, and we're now launching a share issue to grow our business and get more staff on board so that we can carry on responding and sort of taking on inquiries. So this idea that people don't want to pay and can't and don't know about it, we haven't found to be true. To be fair, we are working with the kinds of early adopters to this, but our work with the early adopters does show that there's still a massive skills gap. And so in terms of our challenge, really, it's sort of developing that supply chain to meet the demand that we can see is there and really eager for this kind of work. So in terms of looking at IPPR's report and their recommendations, certainly the skills recommendation and the Green Training Fund we'd really support. I think within that it's worth thinking about who you're targeting. And I do think that sort of working on the existing home improvement sector, so those existing builders, plumbers, the architects are already out there, supporting them to gain the skills they need. But that has to go alongside paid work, because our experience of working with builders is they don't want to go on endless training after endless training for no reason. They'll go on a training if it's relevant to paid work, because they're a business and they're often working tight timelines and tight cash flow. And so any training has to be directly linked to work. And that work, so we're in our system, that work is connected to the householder support. So we directly link and support householders and link them to contractors, and we're seeing that working. And I think maybe there's something missing there in the sort of report recommendations around more than just awareness raising, kind of the hand holding for consumers to be able to undergo what is quite a complex and process that involves fairly big sums of money that, they're potentially putting their homes at risk. So having real solid support so they can do that well is important. Also, I think, we need a lot. There has been some policy that's come out yesterday. I haven't totally digested it, but I do think there is a shame that they haven't the recommendations around retrofit haven't been as good as we would have hoped, and that really needs to go hand in hand with all of the work around heat pumps, because heat pumps alongside well insulated homes are what we need. But if we're sort of promoting heat pumps without promoting sort of fabric first approach, then I think that's quite problematic. So I'll leave that there for now, but I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thanks so much. It's so great to hear on the ground experience, and thank you very much, Philip. Please, sorry we didn't manage to get to questions, but good luck in COP26 questions. But yes, Anika, it was really good to hear that kind of that really on the ground experience, and also it's really heartening to hear that about the level of demand you're experiencing as well. And it's always good to hear that you're kind of oversubscribed to this. And I think. And I think from our point of view, there is definitely something in the kind of the government's argument that actually there will be a kind of early adopters which might help bring down costs and technology, etc. But I think certainly part of our argument, and I think this is again is coming out in the chat as well, is about what support the government can be providing to ensure that everyone's able to afford it, even from now. Those with lower incomes and others that I know that we've got a few questions about. But last but not least, I'm coming to Jenny for her contribution, and then really looking forward to getting into the Q&A. Jenny.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak this morning. For those of you who don't know, the UK Green Building Council is an industry network with a mission to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment. We're a charity with over 600 member organisations now, spanning the entire construction and property sectors, along with a good smattering of academics and local authorities and others. So many congratulations, I should say, on your excellent and comprehensive report, setting out that raft of measures and actions that we as a nation need to put in place if we're to decarbonise our housing stock. Many of your recommendations around minimum standards, an endpoint for gas boiler installations, an end to those stop-start policies and funding schemes, and the need for long-term structural incentives, on which note, thank you so much for highlighting our proposals for a stamp duty incentive. Many of those recommendations echo what we've been saying for a long while now. So, as I already know, I wasn't the only person on this panel or in the audience who pounced on the endlessly awaited heat and building strategy yesterday, in the hope that it might at last deliver that clear, costed and policy-driven trajectory for decarbonising buildings that we've all been waiting for. I know, sadly, that I wasn't the only person who found herself, on balance, disappointed. So what was in it? Given the screaming media frenzy around so-called gas boiler bans, it was good to see the government grasp the nettle in the official press release and set an ambition for all new home heating systems to be low carbon from 2035. But when you drilled down into the detail of the strategy, that actually turned into a phase out from 2035 and only once costs of low carbon alternatives have come down. That falls well short of what UK GBC are calling for, which is a clear cut-off date by 2030, no ifs and no buts. I suppose, really, the centrepiece of the heat and building strategy was the recognition and the right recognition that households are going to need financial help to transition to clean electric heating. IPPR, like us, were calling for substantial grants for so-called able-to-pay households in the order of up to £7,000 a year per household, and critically for the full cost of a heat pump to be grant funded for low-income households. What we have instead is a £4 million boiler upgrade scheme over 3 years, providing £5,000 grants, which, as Josh said, will support only around 30,000 heat pump installations a year, just under the number that are currently being installed anyway, and a drop in the ocean compared with the 900,000 installations the Climate Change Committee say will be needed every year by 2028. And really worryingly for me, there's no sign of those full grants for all low-income households, meaning, if we're not careful, that the gap between rich and poor will widen, not close. The other glaring omission, as far as I'm concerned, is the complete absence of a successor to the ill-fated Green Homes Grant Voucher Scheme. Transitioning to clean heat is great, but not, as others have said, if the energy efficiency of homes isn't upgraded first. That's what the Green Homes Grant required, but unless I'm missing something, those heat pump grants won't. So we run the risk of installing heat pumps in homes that aren't adequately insulated and draft-proofed, which means that the heat pumps won't work efficiently, fuel bills will be unnecessarily high, and we run the additional risk of overloading the electricity grid. On regulation in the owner-occupier sector, which both IPPR and we advocate, we merely had a commitment to explore opportunities to improve the energy performance of owner-occupier homes. This, to me, looks like a real dilution of the commitment in the Energy White Paper at the back end of last year to consult in 2021 on regulatory measures to improve the energy performance of owner-occupied homes. So I'm really hoping that they haven't kind of dropped the ball on this one, because we at UKGPC and you guys at IPPR think that that's critical. And finally, I suppose, where were those proposals for long-term structural drivers of consumer demand, like green stamp duty and 0% VAT on refurbishment and energy-saving measures? As we've seen all too often, we can't rely on grant schemes alone. Of course, they have their place in the policy mix, but on their own, largely because they're here today and gone tomorrow, they won't build that sustained consumer demand that we need, or critically, that industry confidence, when industry has been bruised so many times by schemes that ride into town one day and ride out of town the next. So that's a big missing chunk for me. So I don't know, all in all, the heat and building strategy is what I call half a plan. We do have the budget and autumn spending review next week, so maybe, just maybe, the Chancellor will pull something else out of the hat to plug the gaps. If not, it will be sadly down to IPPR and the rest of us to keep on banging that drum for a comprehensive, long-term retrofit strategy to decarbonise all of our 29 million homes and meet all of our energy and carbon targets. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and that was a really comprehensive analysis, I think, of the government's heat and building strategy. So congratulations on having read it so quickly. There's definitely a lot in there.
I started early and finished late yesterday.
Yeah, I think there were a few early risers and late to beds yesterday with all the reports that were coming out. I'm going to take a number of questions, and I'm going to come round to our panelists in the order of Josh, then Anika, then Zoe, and then Jenny. I'm going to take 4 questions to begin with, and I would suggest that if someone else has already said a point that you wanted to make, then unless you want to just kind of underline and reiterate it, but I suspect there will be some questions that others will feel more comfortable answering than others. The top question we have from an anonymous attendee, but it's really a question about new build and, you know, can we really continue building new homes, new housing developments without the appropriate low carbon technologies in them? You know, we can't go on like this, surely building homes that we know we're going to have to upgrade in future, I think is the essence of that question. The second one is from Madeline. Madeline says, she comments that there was some surprisingly negative reactions in the media from the finance community on the mortgage proposals that were included in the government's homes and building strategy. So the question there is, how can we reassure homeowners and banks that these are positive changes for households and won't result in negative equity? Jenny, that might be one in particular for you. Thirdly, is on disruption and recognizing that actually some of these upgrades will, you know, do involve disruption when you're introducing a heat pump, when you're kind of introducing energy efficiency measures. So how can we help with retrofitting, perhaps a change of ownership? There was a proposal in our report around that, so Josh, as well as others, may well want to answer that. Stephen, no, sorry, and then yeah, Tom, sorry, has asked, and there's been a few comments on this about the quality of materials and concern about the advocating for cavity wall installation without warning of the dangers, making the point that it can damage the fabric of the property and lower its value, in Tom Woolley's opinion. So it would be great to get responses. I mean, Anika, it'd be great to get kind of any thoughts on that, on kind of, you know, how it's going on the ground in terms of the work that you're doing, and what approach you take, and obviously Zoe from the consumer perspective on that as well. But I'm going to come to Josh first. Josh, take your pick and maybe keep your answers as short and pithy as possible so we can get as many questions in. We've certainly got a few, and if you are adding questions in the chat, please do remember to put them into the Q&A if you can. Josh.
Yeah, sure. Some great questions, and I'll try and I suppose to do a very brief answer to some of them, and then really interested to hear what the panel have to say. Apologies if I'm squinting; the sun's just shining in my eyes, but I hope it makes it look like I'm thinking really hard. So I think that, yeah. So in answer to the first question, I totally agree that there is a real challenge with new build homes. We are knowingly building homes now that will need to be retrofitted in future. One potential way to do that is to bring forward the future home standard that the government's discussing, and kind of bring it forward earlier, even if they don't decide, you know, even if they confirm a standard by 2025, they can be introducing it as a kind of as a standard from 2023 onwards. But it's something that definitely needs to be looked at more thoroughly. In terms of the reactions about from the media, from the finance community. So one of our proposals with mortgages is that we need to be putting in place green mortgages for existing homes, not just those looking for new buyers, new buyers looking for new properties, and in return the way it would work would be adding retrofit costs onto existing mortgages and having a lower interest rate in return. We found that can produce quite substantial savings, and it's potentially a more attractive proposition. What's also really key fundamentally is also just putting in place a really comprehensive plan of action that kind of helps to stimulate demand. So that's something that the government is sort of partially done today, but a lot more could be done. And that is something that can help to stimulate demand for these kinds of private finance products. But at the moment, it's perhaps not surprising if the government strategy isn't enough, that it's not, that there's a more muted reaction to the kinds of things like remortgages. In terms of questions of change of ownership, so one of the things that we recommended in our report is having point of sale regulations being introduced for by 2030 for homeowners, so that every time you do sell a property, that the energy efficiency rating has to be upgraded, and potentially the kind of the heating system as well. That's something that I think other devolved administrations like Scotland are considering. So that's something that we think should be brought in there. And then I think the final point, and I see that Tom has made a couple of points around this, kind of both cavity wall insulation and also kind of in reference to heat pumps that have been kind of being taken out in different places. One of the crucial things that I think that I kind of mentioned in the presentation, but really can't be emphasised enough, and this reflects conversations we've also had with installers themselves, is that the actual installation of these kinds of technologies needs to be high quality, needs to be done well. In almost every single case, it's not the technology itself, nor is it it's not the insulation, it's not the heat pump. As one installer put it when we asked them, it's 10% the technology and 90% the quality of the installation and the understanding of the heating system in general. So I think that the answer to that, and in answer to some of the other questions that Tom has put in place, is that there needs to be a really clear understanding of how to install these technologies and how to do it well. And that's crucial both to the lived experience in terms of the energy usage and making sure that that the insulation and heat pumps do actually function as they're supposed to, and that they are together, as many people have already kind of flagged up already. And as Philip mentioned as well, you must have the appropriate insulation for heat pumps. But to make sure that they do function properly, that they need to be installed properly, and also to make sure that there's household trust in these kinds of schemes, in the competence of these schemes. So I think that it cannot be stressed enough that good installation is going to be really key to making sure that these technologies actually work.
Thanks very much, Josh. Anika.
So I'm just going to take the disruption question and Tom's question around materials. So, retrofit is disruptive, and I think it's important. Well, it depends what you're doing, but whole house retrofit certainly, and heat pump installations, if you have to install new radiators and potentially have new plumbing, is disruptive. And I think it's about expectation management, which is kind of where the advice services are so important, as well as, well, from our perspective, it's kind of why we have a sort of proper, a design brief that's designed with people. In funded schemes, I think this can be even more important as to why it's important to do really good tenant engagement when you're working with social housing, or you're working with, people who can engage with funded schemes, of which there are more out these days than there were before. And this is kind of just really supporting what Zoe said during her presentation, that if you don't have people on board, they won't necessarily be engaged enough to use the heat pump or whatever the new system is in their homes well. And if you do engage people well, they can actually deal with the disruption. I think there's a really great example of that in Portsmouth, where they did a Enefit upgrade to council tower blocks, which was very difficult at the on-site phase, but because people were engaged with well, they were willing to put up with that disruption. So I think that's, it just goes to show how important this kind of user-centered approach is when doing retrofit. With the quality of materials and cavity wall installation, I would add to what Josh just said and say, as well as installation, the design is incredibly important, and doing having a retrofit designer or having an architect who's well versed in this, in renovation and retrofit, is so important. And also enabling people to understand what choices they're making, so people can understand natural building materials and can understand the sort of pros and cons of different kinds of materials, and make choices that they feel are right for them. I think Tom will probably say that there's more to do around natural building materials, but I would say design and also allowing people to understand the system better. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Zoe, anything to add on those questions?
Yeah, I think I would just echo what Anika was just saying around disruption, and I think that just really speaks to why we do need much more comprehensive advice offering that doesn't just focus on the digital, and that people have that access to face-to-face support when they need it. But I think this is where the issue of better consumer protections come in, because a key part of that would be having the right standards up front around how installers or designers or developers need to behave, what information that they're giving to consumers up front, so people really know what they're getting into from the get-go and know what to expect. So, you know, that's part of the whole package. When it comes to heat pumps, because I see there's been lots of chat about heat pumps and about whether they work effectively, you know, certainly there is growing evidence that, you know, there's problems with a good number of them. And I think what needs to be done is more needs to be understood as to why those systems are not working as they're supposed to be, why they're expensive. And it's not just down to insulation. So I think we need to have a proper comprehensive review about how some of these systems work, so that we're not storing up a whole host of trouble further down the line where people cannot afford their energy bills. That's not where we want to get to when it comes to net zero. So I think they're the two bits that I would comment on. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Jenny, anything you'd like to add?
Just a couple of things. We were talking about obligations on lenders, and BEIS consulted earlier in the year, I think it was. There's been so many consultations, I can't remember when they all were, on placing a duty on lenders to publish data about the energy performance of their portfolio. And it's worth saying that, I mean, we have 4 of the big 6 lenders in our membership, plus other finance providers. And they were all broadly supportive of the idea of kind of publishing comparative data. I think the point that they did make, though, quite strongly, was that real care needs to be taken to ensure that the right things are being measured and reported on. So different lenders' kind of legacy portfolios may differ very widely, partly depending on the region of the country that the lender operates in, partly depending on their as I say, their historical lending kind of behaviour. So I think it's really important to kind of make sure that lenders don't take the easy way out in an attempt to climb up the rankings and simply withdraw from poorer performing parts of the market. That would be just a really rubbish thing to happen. So it kind of might be better to rank lenders on the basis of the kind of year-on-year improvements in their stock, rather than the absolute performance of their portfolio at a given moment in time. And just on the new build stuff, I completely echo what Josh said. We were very clear in our response to the Future Home Standard consultation that we need to move certainly towards using kind of the in-use energy performance as opposed to the model performance of a new building as the basis of compliance, and that requirements for that should be phased in from 2025, and that fabric energy efficiency standards should be tightened consistently in line with the Climate Change Committee's recommendation, and that we should introduce energy use intensity targets from 2025, covering both currently regulated energy and currently unregulated energy. So new build is clearly the place where, if we get it right, then large markets will be able to be developed and costs will start to be driven down.
Thanks so much, Jenny. So we'll go for another round of questions. We've got quite a few, and just to give everyone fair warning, I will come to you in the order of Zoe, Jenny, Anika, and then Josh this time. Let's see if I can remember that order by the time I've gone through the picked out all the questions. We've got a really good question from Lauren. We've touched on this a little bit. Lauren works for Aging Better, and has asked a bit about views on whole house approach to improving England's homes and doing so in an integrated way, and keen to hear more about your thoughts on incorporating further improvements into any energy efficiency strategy. Tom, I think Josh has really answered the question around heat pumps, hopefully in Salford, that Tom has asked, and that obviously speaks to that what our panelists have been talking about in terms of the importance of other improvements being introduced alongside heat pumps. And we've also touched on some of the issues around materials. Francis, this is definitely one for you, Anika, has asked about the need for a carbon co-ops and people-powered retrofit equivalents in every region. I know you've posted about the money you're raising, the share. I think about how do we get more carbon co-ops in other areas and other regions? It'd be great to hear more about that. Stephen has asked the question about, should we have the fuel poor setting the policies rather than those who are well off and seem to have little idea about how the poor, even the middling masses, he said, don't have the money to do what is required and can't or won't borrow either. And that's certainly something that we've been doing plenty of work on in terms of a fair transition and ensuring that actually those who can least afford it and often are least responsible for the climate crisis can in fact be the ones not just to be protected from the transition in terms of its iniquitous effects, but also reap the most benefits and opportunities from it as well. James Hewitt has got a question around how we might propose that tenants, in particular freeholders, tenants and their landlords and freeholders and their landlords engage, particularly concerning properties which have communal heating systems. James refers to the fact that a large percentage of emissions in some boroughs, such as Westminster, derive from such properties. And one more in this round, it's just disappeared. I think someone may have voted it. Stephen again has asked about why contractors and or individual tradespeople train and pay to be certified when the government has a reputation for changing and dropping policies at a moment's notice. So I think that's a comment on the need for a question around long-term policy in order to give confidence that people can invest, that businesses can invest in the supply chain and workforce, and people can have the confidence that if they train up to do things, that they will actually have jobs to go into because the money and the investment will be there. Right, I think I said I would come to Zoe first. The whole multitude of questions there. Zoe, take your pick.
Okay. So I'm just going to pick three of them that I think would be most useful for me to respond to. So firstly, around the whole house approach, that's great. Yeah, of course, obviously we support that, you know, that is the best way forward. However, I do think we need to be mindful of how that would work best in practice. So EST many years ago did excellent report on trigger points and making changes to your home when it might seem the most obvious time to do so, such as your heating breaks or you're having extension. Obviously, I appreciate this speaks to a certain part of society. So, you know, I think it's about capitalising on those trigger points to do what is necessary to get that house as low carbon as possible. I think for the majority of people, going all in straight away is probably going to be too much. And whilst, yes, that would be great if you have the money or the capital to do that, I think we just need to think about how logically you can do that in a way that works for all people. When it comes to fuel poor and letting people set the policies, again, it speaks to what I was talking about earlier around non-usual suspects. So just getting as many different voices in this net zero transition as possible. It will affect everyone. So therefore, regardless of where you are in life or what you're most interested in, it's still going to have an impact on you. So it's how we are able to engage with consumers from all walks of life, how we are able to make it accessible for them, so that then we can get a real better rounded view of what how net zero can best be delivered for our citizens. And finally, on tenant engagement, I'm just going to speak to The issue of communal heating, as most people know, heat networks are unregulated, and that includes communal heating, and it's something we've campaigned about since 2015. And the government now is on track to regulate for heat networks, and I think something will come out imminently to say what their plans are around that. So absolutely, it's a real issue for tenants to engage. They're not well represented when it comes to communal energy. They don't have anywhere to go for help because there isn't a regulation. So, for example, if they come to us at citizens' advice, we cannot intervene on their behalf because there's no regulation around it. We can't support consumers who might be in need of extra help either. But hopefully, regulation coming forward on heat networks will go some way to better facilitating tenant engagement on that issue. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zoe. Jenny.
Yeah, well done. You're remembering the order. I wrote it down this time, just so that I'd remember. I'm just going to answer a couple of these questions. Whole house improvements, absolutely, that's what we need to do if we're going to get to our EPCC target by 2035, and it's absolutely, totally what we need to do if we're going to get to our net zero targets. Why has that not happened to the extent that we would have liked to see it? I think the main reason is that the obligation on suppliers, the energy company obligation, has encouraged suppliers to meet their obligation at least cost, which tends to mean going into a home, sticking in a boiler, going to the next home, sticking in a boiler, and not doing all the ancillary stuff that needs to be done to make that successful in energy efficiency terms. I think it's also partly a skills issue. You know, the lovely tradespeople who come into our homes to do these kinds of works tend not to be kind of multi-skilled retrofit contractors. You know, they have the thing that they can do and not the other things. So I think we really need to see this kind of multi-skilling of retrofit contractors, or at least teams that can offer that whole house service, even if it's different people in the team that offer the service. So I think that's a very important consideration too. Should we have the field force setting the policies? I would absolutely love it. The trouble, as we all know, is that low-income households, vulnerable households, tend not to have they often don't have the technology, which is why I'm so worried about them, along with everyone else, having to kind of rush to get these limited grant offerings that have been around in the past and that are currently offering. So, you know, you would be asking a group of people who currently do not have a kind of visibility or a voice to take the reins. But my goodness, I think the outcomes would be a whole lot better if they did. And then I've touched on this already. Why should the industry take on people, train people, upskill people when, you know, a policy or funding program, as I put it before, you know, rides into town today and rides out of town tomorrow? That's a huge thing that has bedeviled our ability to deliver energy efficiency upgrades at the speed and at the volume that's necessary. And that's why we and you guys are strongly advocating these longer term, stable, consistent drivers of consumer demand, like green stamp duty, like 0% VAT, so that homeowners start to see the benefit of energy efficiency, start to value it in the same way as currently they value a nice kitchen or you know, a large number of bedrooms. And that way we also start to drive a kind of value differential in the property market as a whole in favour of better energy performing and better carbon performing homes. So, as I said in my introductory remarks, that was a big disappointment for me that we saw none of that in the heat and building strategy yesterday.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Anika.
Yeah, so on the whole house approach, I think, yeah, it's a misnomer to think whole house approach means doing the house at one time. For us, what we understand that as is understanding how a home different parts of a home interact with each other. And I think there's been too much of a history of single measures approach to retrofit. And actually then you get into the risks and the problems. So it's kind of understanding how does that air tightness work interact with air quality in the house and making sure that ventilation's a part of the strategy. And so having a whole house plan that you might undertake over many years, and that's kind of where it comes down to these kind of home build people call them building passports. We have our kind of home energy assessment, which is a kind of plan for a staged plan for the house over many years, starting with the low-hanging fruit, going to the more advanced stuff. And then people, when they do decide to redo their kitchen, they'll do something that they won't have to take out or contradict in the future at another point. And it's just making sure that the whole project is working so that in 10 years time perhaps you've got a whole house that sits together well. And so I guess I understand that in different contexts we need to be able to explain that in the non-able to pay context, that we still need a whole house approach and a sort of longer term plan, which again is why the tenant engagement is so important, because if people are sort of treated badly the first time round, they're not necessarily going to be that keen for the second part of the plan. So yeah, that's super important. In terms of carbon copy, people powered retrofit in every region. Yeah, thanks. That's really nice of you to say, and we get that a lot actually. As a part of people powered retrofit, replicating what we do is really important, and there are community energy organisations across the UK who are really keen on what we do. We're working with a couple of like-minded ones already in Cumbria, Devon and Bristol. And, you know, if you're interested in what we do, we're really keen to work with you so that our plan isn't to become a nationwide organisation. We're very much focused in the locality of Greater Manchester and the surrounding regions, but we're really keen to support others to understand what we do and replicate what we do. In terms of Stephen's comment on fuel pools setting the policy, I wish democracy worked that way. I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of the policies are very unjust because they come from a very particular subset of society, unfortunately. In terms of engaging people, we are doing some work in Oldham where we're working in depth with 24 people from 2 very marginalised communities in Oldham who aren't your usual suspects, who don't have a previous history of understanding this work. But we're working over 8 months of full-day workshops where we're supporting them to understand the issues and then create their own local energy plans and work with Oldham City Council with those plans. And that's quite an exciting project. And I think that could be a way that we could move toward having better participation in energy democracy and planning if we really do engage with people on the ground. And actually the things that come up for people won't be things that the policymakers will assume will come up. But actually we're seeing like people being really keen on renewable power generation, being really keen on public transport, being really keen on all sorts of stuff, and having very sort of, you know, and it's very related to their locality and the things that impact them in their life, and also ensuring they have community benefit. So I do think it's worth checking out Oldham Energy Futures if you're interested in that. And I do think it is possible to do democracy like that. I don't think we should give up on people and assume they won't understand how to do these things. Yeah, if we can move towards doing that at local level, then never mind national level, and then we see what happens. Hopefully we have a change of government. And then the final point, I just completely agree with Jenny on the contractors and confidence. Really, unfortunately, last year, I was working quite closely with contractors around the Green Homes Grant Scheme, and there were builders who were mainstream builders, hadn't done retrofit before, who got really enthused, and they weren't burnt by the Green Deal because they didn't know about the Green Deal, so they got enthused by the Green Homes Grant. And it was really sad to see that they paid up the money. Thousands of pounds for a small building firm is a lot of money, you know, and a lot of time and effort to retrain and get on the Trustmark scheme and get on the PAS 2030. And then to see that scheme sort of be said, well, when we're cancelling that, and you know, you need to get your vouchers in before March, is absolutely appalling. And I don't understand how we're going to build the supply chain if we keep on treating people like that. That really needs to change.
Thanks so much, Anika. I'm going to come to Josh now, then I think we're going to wrap up because we're very much in the time. I'm sorry that we've not been able to answer all of your questions. I know there's still many questions unanswered, but hopefully this can be, well, it's not the beginning of a conversation, but an ongoing conversation, and certainly we will be continuing our work in this area, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But Josh, and you've just got a few minutes, Josh.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of it's been said, and I mean, I agree with pretty much everything that's already been said. I think to add just a few extra things on the kind of moving towards whole house, I think house approaches. I totally agree with that. I think that certainly when it comes to multiple retrofits at the same time is something that we need to be doing more of. It's something that the government is considering in its upcoming energy company obligation, but obviously we need to see proper funding for that. It's worth saying that although ideally you'd want to do a lot of multiple retrofits and have, if you like, the most comfortable home that you could possibly have. The Climate Change Committee estimates that around 2/3 of homes would need £1,000 or less of retrofitting to have a heat pump working at the same time. That's not necessarily the same thing as saying having the best possible energy insulation to maximize comfort and kind of bill savings in your home. But there is a question of the extent to which you do this retrofitting. One of the good things that we could be doing is looking at kind of scaling up whole house retrofitting in social homes, because they are already kind of on average at a higher energy efficiency level. So and have social landlords that are kind of have an obligation to make their homes comfortable for their tenants. So that's a good area where we could potentially be kind of scaling up the supply chain to do this a lot more, and an area where I say there's a kind of a social obligation to potentially do so. On the question about contractors, again, and sort of and people having confidence, Anika's, I think, absolutely spot on when it's talking about the Green Homes Grant experience. I think that the current strategy, the current heat and building strategy that's out, sets out funding for about 3 years, but as we've already mentioned, it's 3 years as opposed to 1 year with the Green Homes Grant, but the funding is nowhere near enough. The actual pot of funding, 450 million, is substantially less than was promised by the Green Homes Grant in 1 year, and even that wasn't enough. So I think that there is a serious increase in funding and a serious long-term commitment that needs to be set out, because you're absolutely right, Stephen, in asking this question, and Anika, that there's going to be a real confidence issue in these schemes if you don't kind of set out a more substantive plan. I think there is some confidence from kind of initial reactions, and obviously if you're someone like Octopus Energy, you're already investing in a lot of this, but that's because they have their own resources and financial resources to be able to do so, and not every company has that. So great, if they can do this, but this needs to be available to others. And then the final thing, I agree with the idea of having more consultation with affordable homes and actually listening to them. We've done some kind of focus groups where we've heard about people saying they need kind of support for grants, with grants and public information campaigns as well. But I couldn't agree more with that approach.
Thanks very much, Josh. I did want to mention the work of our Cross-Party Environmental Justice Commission, which published its final report in July of this year, in which we are continuing to do work on. The report set out a plan of how we can deliver on the net zero ambitions and restore nature, but also addressing and tackling wider economic and social injustices as well. So very much taking that kind of fairness-based approach and thinking about actually how do we use this as a moment to this moment of change in our economy, not just to tackle the climate and nature emergency, but also improve the lives of people who are suffering kind of under that through the current kind of economic model. First of all, why wouldn't you do that if you're making these changes? And there are lots of benefits and opportunities in this change that could be maximised if policy is designed in the right way. And second of all, that report also argues that not only is it desirable, but it's also going to be necessary. We're not going to take the public with us. We're not going to secure and maintain the public support for what is going to be a very long transition. It's not a matter of weeks or months. This isn't going anywhere. It's going to take years and decades, and therefore we need to continue to take the public with us, and therefore it absolutely has to be delivered in a fair way. And we would completely agree with those who've said about the engagement with the public, because we carried out that work through 4 citizens' juries in areas around the country that are going to be particularly affected, and we will be building on that programme in future. But I just wanted to say a massive thank you to our speakers, to Philip and Tracy, who've had to depart, to Anika, Zoe and Jenny as well, and also to Josh for leading the work on this report. Thank you to the IPPR events team who have helped put on the events today, And thanks so much to our audience for your great questions and contributions as well. I don't know what the answer is. I know lots of people have asked about sharing the chat. I will see whether that's something that we can do with the participants afterwards. But thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day and enjoy reading the 4,000 or 3,000 pages of government strategies that have come out this week. That'll certainly keep us busy until COP, at least I would have thought. Thanks very much.